Hello and thanks for joining me. In this little video I'm going to call a workflow walkthrough. My intention here is to take some images that have some processing challenges and make videos about how that can be done using open source tools and occasionally some other tools as well. I want to thank Alan Stoltz for submitting this beautiful image to me. Alan is part of the photographers group and he generously sent me this image and asked me if I could take a look at it and see if I could get better results from it using some of the tools in Darktable than he was able to. So let's take a look. What makes this image challenging? Well, unfortunately, it has been a little bit overexposed, so Alan has lost the highlights in this area of the sky, and frankly, there's nothing we're going to be able to do to get those back entirely. But we will be able to minimize the effect. As you can see, as we look at them currently, they're quite harsh looking, and absent of any detail through large areas. So we'll see what we can do to pull that back. At the same time, the image has a lot of dynamic range. We have some very deep shadows down here, but we do still have detail in those shadows, so we're going to be able to recover a lot there. And I think we can pull this image out and give it a little bit of punch. So this is the unedited raw file that we're looking at right now. Darktable has automatically applied a number of, I'll call them adjustments, but these are basically things that are simply necessary to take a raw file and display it. So the raw black and white points have been set by default. The image has been demosaicked, and the input and output color profiles have been defined, and the orientation's been defined. So, first things first, I'm going to I'm going to pull the exposure down on this image and see what I can do about recovering any information from those highlights. So I'm going to go into the basic adjustments module and turn that on, and I'm going to pull down the exposure. Let's see, just so that at least in the histogram up here I don't have any clipping on any parts. So it's really, there's not much I can do. It's already even though I've pulled it down, I can see already that the histogram ends. So there's really just no data left beyond that point. But I'm going to leave it at about, I'm going to go to a quarter of a stop just to give myself a little bit of room to work with. And I think I can make this look a little better as we move forward. I'm not going to change anything else in basic adjustments right now. This gives me my starting point. Maybe my black levels just a little bit. I'll just pull the blacks down and just get those. Okay, good. I want to pull up my bottom here. Turn on. If I turn on the clipping indication for raw file, you can see that, yeah, it's indicating that we've definitely got some clipping up here in the clouds, but I don't see any clipping on the blacks, so we're good there. And if I just turn on the JPEG over under exposure, it's showing me clipping down here in the blacks, but that's nothing I need to worry about. All right, first things first, we're going to use the Filmic module, which is going to help us reduce the dynamic range of this image a little bit more. And I'm going to turn it on and leave it at its defaults and see what it does. And it brightens up the entire image, increases contrast, but it throws a lot of things out of whack. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the middle gray luminance to what it should be, which is about 18%. Okay, and that darkens the entire image. That's okay. Now I'm going to start to adjust my white exposure. Pull my white exposure down until my sky starts to look a little bit better. Even though it's not quite natural, it does start to look a little bit less harsh. I'm going to leave it. Let's try that there. Now we're going to pull some black exposure out of this. No, wrong direction. Move my black exposure. Try to compress the dynamic range of this image a little bit. Okay. It still doesn't look very good, but bear with me. We're just sort of getting this thing started. scale the dynamic range. I don't need to go that way. Pull it this way. Filmic's primary purpose here is to just make sure that we get the entire dynamic range in gamut, that at least the dynamic range that's viewed. And it also does a neat thing where it reduces the saturation at the extreme luminance. So it reduces saturation in the darkest blacks and in the whitest whites. And what that does is it tends to make an image look a little bit more filmic, because film has a characteristic where the saturation of the brightest parts of the image falls off and the darkest parts of the image falls off as well. So I think we're gonna leave this as it is and see where we can go from here. All right, so the next step that I'm going to do is to use the I should have applied lens correction, so I'm going to go ahead and apply lens correction. Didn't really make much of a change. Sometimes that actually changes the brightness. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to go into the tone equalizer, and this is where I'm really going to start to bring this image together. So the tone equalizer is a new tool in Darktable 3, and it does take a little bit of getting used to, but it is an extremely powerful tool for basically tone mapping, and it's particularly useful on images with a lot of dynamic range like this one. It makes the job very easy of bringing that dynamic range together without creating halos and other ugly artifacts. So the key to understanding the tone equalizer is to talk a little bit about masking. What it actually is doing is dodging and burning with a mask, and if I click this, it'll show me the mask that's going to be used. So this is the mask that the tone mapping is applied, and it goes from the darkest areas of the image down here, which it says are at -6 EV, to the brightest areas of the image up here, which are at right around zero EV. And because it applies this mask and uses a blur, that's what prevents you from getting halos when you make adjustments to different parts of the image. So be that as it may, there's a couple things you need to do to make this work very well. One is you want to try to get this mask somewhere centered. If we look at the mask now, we can see that the mask is pushed pretty far towards the highlights. So if I come in here to masking, I'm going to use some exposure compensation on the mask to move it down, probably about a half a stop. And let's take a look at where that is. That's better. That's quite good, 3/4 of a stop. And then we're going to expand the contrast on the mask a little bit to try to fill out as much of the dynamic range as we can. Actually, I'm going to put it back 0. Okay, so now this is the mask that we're going to work with. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that all the areas that are the same tone of gray in this are treated as a similar exposure level and can be adjusted together. In practice, what it means is I can now either drag points on this curve to do tone mapping, or I can come over the image itself and my crosshairs show me what EV I'm at and allow me to scroll and directly adjust the exposure value of the area that I'm working on. So I'm going to increase the exposure values here in my shadows, and you can see the curve on the right hand side of the screen is showing that increase. And I'll just keep bringing those up until the darker areas of the image look the way I want them to look. I'll go down here to some of the deepest parts. Oops, that jumped a little bit too quickly. Yeah, a little too far there. I'm going to pull this back down. It doesn't look natural when you get... Okay, and then I'll start to move into some of my brighter portions of the image. I think this got brightened a little bit too much, so I'm going to pull this down. That's not bad. I've pulled some detail out of the shadows here. I've definitely brought the image up a little bit. Let's take a look at the comparison. Let's go back to the original image here, and I'm going to take a snapshot. Then I'll go back to where I'm at now and view that snapshot. So this is what the image looked like before I started to make my adjustments, And this is what the image looks like after I started to make my adjustments. So what I've really done is tried to bring out uh, some brightness in some of the darker areas of the image and pull down the sky a little bit so that the brightest parts of the sky don't look quite so harsh and it looks a little bit more natural now. Okay, so we'll just turn that snapshot off. We can come back to that. Oops. Okay, let me see. What do I want? What happens if I pull up here a little bit? I'm going to bring these shadows up a little bit more. See how far I can push them before things start to look a little too unnatural. All right, I think that's definitely brought out some details here in the gazebos, some detail here in the fencing, and brought out a lot of detail in the tree. It has started to make the image look a little bit washed out, and a little bit low contrast. We can play with that a little bit too. I'm gonna pull back on my highlight adjustments here just the slightest amount. But you see I do have a little bit of a tail off now here on my curve instead of an abrupt end, which is why these clouds don't look quite so harsh as they did before. Okay, so I've lost a little bit of punch in the image as far as color, and a little bit of local contrast and sharpening are still needed. So I'm going to go into the color balance module and I'm going to turn up the output saturation to try to get a little bit of depth of color back into the image. That looks pretty good. Let's understand that, everybody has their own appreciation for what an image should look like, and my idea of a nice looking image could be your idea of oversaturated, but I want to bring a little bit of saturation in here. It's a nice bright scene with some good color in it. We want to make sure we don't lose that. Now I'm going to do one thing quickly. I'm going to jump into the highlight reconstruction module and play with some of the settings here. Rather than clip the highlights, I'm going to switch this so that they're reconstructed in luminance, chrominance, and hue, LCH. And I'll back down on the clipping threshold just a little bit. Oh, that's much better. I think the clouds here now, if I set this back to, look at the difference here. I'm going to zoom in on these clouds. Okay. Give Darktable a minute here. Alright, I'm going to change this mode here. If I say to clip highlights, this is what my clouds look like. They really lack any texture, any depth whatsoever. But if I reconstruct the highlights, now I have a much more natural appearance. I've actually recovered a good bit of texture in the clouds, and they look like real clouds now. They no longer look like they've been chopped off. So I'm very happy with that. I'm very happy with that. Let's get this back to our full size view. Good. So now really for me, this image is getting into the final adjustments. I'm going to bring some pop back to the image by making some local contrast adjustments, and then maybe doing a little bit of cloning and healing to get rid of some of the less desirable objects that are in the image. Okay, contrast equalizer. Contrast equalizer, I could use sharpening on this. Sharpening uses the same tools that have been around for decades, the unsharp mask. The contrast equalizer is a lot more effective in my opinion. It's one of my favorite tools. So I'm going to come in here to the contrast equalizer, and basically this is showing me big features on the left and small features on the right. And if I increase the contrast of small features, it tends to increase micro contrast and sharpness, what appears to be sharpness. If I increase features on the left, it does things with the bigger parts of the image and starts to increase contrast between larger parts. I don't want that in this case. It can actually be interesting for things like skies to bring that up a little bit. I can make the skies look a little bit better. And then I'm going to come down here to the small end, and I'm going to pull up on this, and that is going to just bring a little bit of pop back into the image without getting carried away. So if I turn the whole module off and turn it back on, maybe hard to see the difference over a YouTube video, but in person the image gets a lot of life back just from this little bit of local contrast and sharpening. Okay, so that's about it for adjustments, major adjustments. Now, I like this image a lot. It's got a great curving line leading me right up to the gazebo here, and another line coming down off of the hillside there, also leading me to the gazebo, clearly making this my main point of interest. Beautiful reflection in the water. Nice line coming here out of the corner. Couple things about the image that, you know, Alan certainly couldn't do anything about. This railing here, well, it would take a lot of work to get rid of that. We're going to leave that alone. Looks like a boat or something sitting in the water over here. I think I can pretty easily get rid of that with a crop, and that would still represent what we'd probably use if we were going to print this at 8x10. If I use a 4x3 crop, I can see that it gets rid of that boat, and frankly I don't lose any real interest in the image, in my opinion anyway. So I'm going to go ahead with that 4x3 crop. And the boat's gone. And the only other thing in the image that sort of bothered me was, and I'm going to, for the moment, I'm going to turn off the tone equalizer so that I can speed things up a little bit on my end. This is some sort of a wire or cable running across the water right in this area here, and it just is a little bit of a distraction. I could spend a lot of time going in and cloning this out in Photoshop or another tool, but I can actually do quite a bit of that right here in Darktable without working too hard. So I'm going to come into my retouch. I'm going to put it in the clone mode, and I'm not going to kill myself over this. I'm just going to come in and draw a quick path over this. Okay, and now I'm going to show the path, and it's cloning from down here, and I want it to clone from up here. And I'm going to shrink this down a little bit. There we go. Let's see, let's turn my path off. That's not bad. I'm happy with that. If I was pixel peeping, I could probably see some artifacts in there, but boy, at 100%, it looks pretty good to me. All right, let's turn our tone equalizer back on and see what our image looks like. Now let's do a little bit before and after, okay? Come over here to our snapshots, and let's go back and see what the raw file looked like. So there's our raw file with a lot of detail lost in the shadows and a lot of detail lost in the highlights, and a bit drab and flat looking in the areas of interest here. The gazebos get lost a little bit because it's so bright behind them. And what we've done is we've pulled that brightness down behind the gazebos, brightened the gazebos themselves up, and pulled some color out and some detail out in the hillside, and pulled a little bit of detail and color out here in the fencing. And at the end of it, I think we have a pretty respectable image. So I hope you found this useful and interesting. I'd like to do more of these. If you'd like to have your image worked on and see what I can make of it, please send me a message through our Facebook group, the Photographers group, and I'll be happy to take a look. You can also instant message me or direct message me on YouTube if you see this video on YouTube and want me to look at your image. Thank you all very much, and have a good day.